this idea that you have to consume food less than 3 hours after it's been cooked is very much a product of tropical thinking. People think that you put the rye first for some flavor thing. Actually not. It turns out is a way of finding out the temperature of the oil. 5 liters of water in one shot is toxic for you. 3 grams of nutmeg is toxic for you. Half a teaspoon of clove oil is toxic for you. Most spices are super toxic, by the way. No proof that tea is good. In fact, too much green tea, bad for the liver. On your day-to-day basis, please use iodized salt or buy one of those pink salts that is iodized.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Keto Press. You know, when you are cooking in the kitchen, what happens is that we all have a little advice that comes on from mothers, grandmothers, and we kind of just go with it. Like, you know, the chana cup, you put the potli in the chana, or you have a chalk and there's a particular way of doing it. But there's a science behind it, and I have somebody with me who is going to make that, and he's going to tell us how that happens and what is the science behind all of this. And actually everything that happens in the kitchen is based on science, and we don't even think about it. So let's dive into it, because I'm super excited to get to know what else he has to say. So Krish Ashok is a Delhi University graduate, and he's a cellist, he's a guitarist, he's a violinist, and he's the global head of digital workplace
yes.
at TCS. Yeah. And now he's shooting straight from his table. So how did that happen, Krish?
I think even if I'm working anywhere, I mean, we still have to eat 2 or 3 times a day. And as someone who's been cooking and been curious about food since I was a teenager, and then I lived in the US for about 7 years where I had to learn to cook. So cooking has always been interesting to me, and as someone who's always loved science, it just ended up being the language that I used to understand cooking, right? It's not like our grandmothers are amazing cooks, right? But it's not like they speak the language of science. Science is merely a language, right? So you don't need to know science to know how to cook well, right? But science just offers you a way of precisely describing what's happening, right? So that you can pass it on to the next generation. So I've loved science communication. And I used to write columns on, explaining popular science and so on. And I think around the pandemic time, it sort of felt like the good opportunity to combine food and science. And, nobody had written a book on the science of cooking. And then that's how Masala Lab was born. And then now the illustrated edition as well.
That's amazing. It is actually whatever you do, the science behind it, we don't think of it, but there is a reason why all of this happens.
Yeah.
And I didn't know for the longest time that why do you put the rye first and the fat. And there's a scientific reason for all of it.
So strangely enough, people think that you put the rye first for some flavor thing. Actually not. It turns out is a way of finding out the temperature of the oil, right? So because it just so happens that the mustard pops at just about the right temperature of the oil, so it's safe for you to add the other spices without burning them, right? So if it just pops like too fast and violently, it's too hot, and so you want to wait, right? So the mustard itself actually lends no flavor to the dish other than actually a little bit of texture, right? If you want mustardy flavor, you have to soak mustard in water, like Bengalis do. So it's just practical heuristics that I sort of recognize that our grandmothers learned from their mothers and from their mothers and so on.
Yeah. So who is Krish Ashok? Because we hear you talk about stuff that normally is contrary to what other people's opinions are. So should we actually be listening to what you say?
That's right. So one of the things I tell people is, don't assume anyone is a guru, right? I think in India we have a tendency to glorify individuals over institutions and processes and the scientific method, right? And we would rather trust, some sort of religious person telling us something about food when that person has clearly never cooked a day in their life. But we're not willing to listen to, say, a nutritional sort of institution telling you that these are your macros and so on, because we tend to trust individuals over. And I find the same thing, right? So now that if you have like 620,000 Instagram followers, people actually blindly tend to accept what you say without question. And I keep telling people, no, I think it's dangerous, right? So I hopefully want to focus on giving you a set of thinking methods that allow you to be skeptical, right? I mean, I'm not taking a contrarian position. Actually, I'm just taking a first principles approach, right? So if somebody says heating honey is toxic, I merely want to ask the question, how? and why. Explain what toxins, at what temperature, right? How much, right? So these are all just logical questions. There's not really questioning the status quo. And I find that if you don't have the next level basic answers to the why, then I think, that's shallow knowledge, right? And I think, science requires you to really go down to the first principles.
Yeah, that's true. And like you're saying very correctly, it's what people kind of just blindly follow, and you're very clear how you want to approach it. And a lot of people who just, like you said, you're 50,000 followers. Some don't agree with what you say, and we know that a lot of people don't.
Yes.
But there are also a lot of people who understand the entire science and how you're talking. There is a method to it.
So in a sense, in a weird sense, I think social media is one of those strange beasts where there are people who follow you because people like following people, right? It's a cult thing, right? And people who have these large followings, I mean, it's candid. I have to say that it's sort of like you're worshipping someone, right? It's a cult thing. Then there are people who follow you because they absolutely hate you and disagree with you, and they follow you because they want to call you out every time you make a mistake, and they want to sort of enjoy that, right? So these are the two extreme things that unfortunately is what you see on social media. The iceberg beneath the surface, at least for me on Instagram, has been I would actually say 3/4 of the people who follow me are just quiet people at home looking for sensible, sane, non-scaremongering advice about food on doubts that they have, right? They're forever bombarded with things that are scaring them, and they're not quite sure. For example, they might have been doing something. Like, for example, people will tell you they're not supposed to make a cucumber raita because apparently you're not supposed to mix cucumber and curd according to Ayurveda, right? Okay. And so people are worried. I mean, they've been making cucumber raita for a long while. Where did this come in? And so the interesting thing is that when I then point out that Ayurveda actually has nothing to say about cucumbers. Okay. Absolutely not at all. It does have a lot to say about yogurt. It has nothing to say about cucumbers because the cucumbers we use today came to India much later. So they weren't around when Ayurveda books were being written. So I think I sometimes tell people that you don't have to take this sort of very aggressive contrarian position that Ayurveda is wrong, but you can absolutely take the position that the people today who are using that term are misrepresenting it. I'm sure they're not reading those books or genuinely interpreting it or testing it in the modern context. I mean, how can Ayurveda have an opinion on refrigeration, right? Or microwaves? Right?
Yes.
They didn't exist back in the day. Right? How can someone 2000 years ago have an opinion on that, right? Or an informed opinion on that? And while you can still appreciate the fact that they made those choices to keep people safe at a time when things would spoil very quickly, milk would spoil very quickly, fish would spoil very quickly, and so they made up rules that made sense in the context of that time.
I totally agree with you. And refrigeration is one of the things I did want to ask you about, because I think there are two very strong camps about it. Yeah. And your science behind it, and rightly so, is that in such an age, this is what it is.
It is what it is. And again, what it is. And refrigeration is, so I think people sometimes, if they just grow up in India, and if they have an opportunity to say travel to the West or Europe or a place where the room temperature is actually pretty much refrigeration temperature, right? I mean, in those days, homes would be 7 or 8 degrees, in England or in the Nordics, right? People would just keep things around, and people would let things stay around at room temperature for long amounts of time because they would not spoil, right? And so it is pretty evident that this idea that you have to consume food less than 3 hours after it's been cooked is very much a product of tropical thinking, where absolutely food starts to spoil 30 minutes after I cook it in Chennai. Yeah. In Delhi in the winter, it's going to stay 4 or 5 hours without being spoiled in the winter, right? Weird thing, right? So in winter, coconut oil in Delhi is solid, something that I didn't realize till I came to Delhi. Yeah. Coconut oil is liquid all the time in South India because the temperature never goes below 18 ever, right? Which is when coconut oil melts. So I think when people kind of know about the rest of the world, then it opens up their mind to say that, yeah, this is fine. And I think the Mediterranean people, the Japanese people, Southeast Asians, Nordics and people, these are people who use the refrigerator, who do eat a lot of old fermented food for days on end, and they live 20 years longer than Indians do, right? So I have no idea what is it that we're actually trying to protect in that case.
And I think it's a lot about convenience as well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not possible to be working, kids, come back home. It's very difficult, and I think maybe in the earlier days, because the women were at home, it just was an easier way of life.
It is so convenience is convenience has always been resisted in India, in at least many parts of Asia and so on, in the more patriarchal parts of the world. My great-grandfather would say no gas stove, right? You must use the wood-fired oven, and die from bronchitis at the age of like 50, right? In an unventilated kitchen. And then my grandmother's time, my grandfather would say no pressure cooker. You must cook the dal on an open pot, and spend more fuel, spend more time in the kitchen, and no mixie, because you're supposed to grind it with the hand and so on, because the flavor is more and so on. And now we find the same category of people like my great-grandfather and grandfather now saying things like no microwave, no fridge, no using old food, no eating fermented food, everything must be cooked fresh. And I think there was a reel that I put out that say that the chapatis tend to go stale very quickly, right? So that's starch retrogradation, right? So starch recrystallizes and becomes hard, and that's just the way it is. And so chapatis have to be eaten hot, right? And it puts a tremendous pressure on people to keep making it fresh, right? One by one for people in the house. And so when I said, you know what, if you freeze the chapati, actually it won't retrograde, because retrogradation happens only between like 3 and like 20-30 Celsius. It does not happen at freezing temperatures. So the best way to keep your bread or sourdough bread or your chapatis fresh is to put them in the freezer, and you can eat them for months.
Yeah, that's what I learned when I went to the US, and they would just take it out of the freezer, and I'm like, are you crazy?
Yeah.
We go to our dukaan, we pick up our bread every day.
Yeah.
And we just think that if it comes out of the fridge, it's not that as fresh.
Yeah.
But they do that all the time.
The word fresh is, people, if you really interrogate them, they will not have a very clear definition of what fresh means. Or that people will disagree with each other on what fresh means. And those disagreements will vary by culture, by society, west, east, south, north. And it will also vary by economic class. So a poorer person is actually less likely to have hang-ups about eating older food, because they don't want to waste food, right? A rich, privileged person with a cook is going to say, I want everything fresh, right? So I think it is just that. So as long as people recognize that their preference, it's actually perfectly fine to say, I will only eat fresh food. As long as you don't make someone else, cook it for you, I think it's fine. I mean, of course, you're willing to pay a cook for it, that's fine too. But, if your own family members, you say, no, it must be made fresh for me. Unpaid labor, that's a very typical Indian mindset.
Okay, I have to ask you this. When I was prepping for your interview, I came across your blog.
Oh,
and
from many years ago, yes.
Yes, and it's called Doing Jalsa and Showing Jilpa.
Yes.
So I was totally zapped about this, and I was talking to my editor, and she's a Tamilian.
Yes.
And the moment I said this, I said, Krish has this blog, and I can't figure out what the reason for this is.
Yes.
And she's like, Tamil movie. And then she gave me the name of some movie, and then she said it has a cult following.
Yes.
She's crazy about movies as well.
Yes.
So where did the name come from, and how did you start a blog about it?
So when I started blogging, there was this cult film that sort of become cult around the time when I started my blog. And it was one of those films that not necessarily like a massive hit or anything, but those who enjoyed it well and truly completely enjoyed it. It was a movie about street cricket.
Okay.
In a way that it captured that essence of Chennai street cricket in a way that no other film in any other language did. And it had this like amazingly fresh take on humor itself, and a very not cheesy humor at all, very sophisticated humor. And there was a cult song from the film called, in Tamil it's basically Doing Jalsa and Showing Jilpa. So Jalsa is basically, Chennai Tamil has influences of Portuguese, Telugu, Urdu, because it's a port city, right? I mean, over the years. So the Tamil spoken there has words from everywhere. And so Jalsa comes from Urdu, right? Doing Jalsa is having fun, right? Jilpa again is a weird word, probably comes from Telugu, which means speaking confidently about things you have no clue about. Right, which in my 20s kind of sounded like me, right? So I said, yeah, this is exactly what my blog is.
So you started this like 20 years ago?
Yeah, so this was started in 2007, 2006.
Wow, that time blogging was not even a...
It was only in Bangalore and Chennai because IT kind of took off in Bangalore and Chennai, and then later Hyderabad. So the first generation of people in India who got access to the internet, middle class people who got access to the internet, was in Chennai and Bangalore. So there were tons of these early bloggers, right? And it was a cult thing, right? And those blogs had like huge following. I mean, for that time, right?
I'm sure.
People would wait for things to be posted and then leave a comment saying that, yeah, I was the first to comment, and things like that. But yeah, so those were the times. So that is when I had started this blog.
So from the blog to now Instagram, where everything is instantly
90 seconds. 200. I mean, it's interesting, right? I see myself as a now largely a writer who specializes in writing 255 words, which is the number of words that I can speak at my speaking pace in 90 seconds in a reel. So 255 words.
So you measure that?
Yeah.
Like you,
so but I do write like 1,000 words or 800 words and then keep condensing it till it becomes as informative and as dense, and I remove all the unnecessary things as possible so that I'm left with 255 of the most impactful kind of words. So it's a very weird skill in a way. I wish people actually were okay to listen to 5-6 minute videos, but they're not, right? I mean, so that's
people's
the word.
attention spans are so low.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. So when we say Indian food, what does that mean to you? So for me, it means mostly about different parts of the country have so many different flavors, different spices everybody uses.
Yeah.
What does Indian food mean to you?
It's a very weird question. It's a question that I grappled with when I wrote my book, right? When I said Science of Indian Cooking, I had to have an idea of what is Indian cooking, right? And it turns out it's a very complicated thing to define, right? Because for starters, if you leave aside the political boundaries, the food of Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka are all culturally integrated in the style of cooking, which basically, and the way I look at it is that all of these cuisines, every regional cuisine in these places starts with heating fat and putting spices. This is what uniquely defines this part of the world. It's not true for any other part of the world. So Mexican food doesn't start by heating fat and putting spices. They start from a different base, right? And likewise, Western cooking doesn't start this way. Or Chinese cooking is always about wok and high temperature, this thing, and they put all the ingredients. So spices actually kind of go in later, right? They do ginger, garlic, and so on, but it's very different. Whole spices in hot fat is very unique to this region. Southeast Asia does pastes in hot oil.
Yeah.
Here we do whole spices in hot oil, right? And I kind of recognize that the fat you choose and the spices you choose actually define the regional flavor. So that was essentially one of the premises of my book, that you could actually go find a YouTube, some YouTube recipe or a blog, some food blog recipe, and let's say it is a Sindhi recipe of some kind, right? And you could just simply replace the fat, which could be groundnut or ghee, and the spices they use with panchforan, and don't change anything else. It will taste Bengali. If you change it with coconut oil and those 5 things that Keralites use, it will taste Malabar, right? Sesame oil and those 5 things that Chettinad use, it will taste Chettinad, right? So fat plus whole spices is literally 80% of the flavor of any dish from any part of India, right? So from this region, this cultural region. So in that sense, it sort of began to me that maybe that's the overarching definition, right? So because the problem is, India as we know it is a political boundary created in 1947. And before 1947, the boundaries were different. Right? It included Pakistan, it included Bangladesh, and so on. And if you go back 1,000 years, it did not include South India. Right? Okay. So a very weird thing that people don't realize is that Kerala and Tamil Nadu, these two geographical locations, prior to 1947, have never been part of any integrated Indian kingdom. Never.
Really?
Yes. Not Ashoka, not the Mughals, not the Guptas, not Kanishka, not anyone else. Their boundaries ended here. So they consider everything south of that to be barbarians.
So in a time where people are chasing keto and high protein and low carbs, how does Masala Lab fit into the scheme of things? How does it work?
Weirdly enough, when I wrote the book, I had sort of like a going in principle that this book would not touch upon nutrition and diet at all. The going in position was that this book would stop at the moment the food leaves your mouth and goes inside. So I was only interested in, to the point where, how your taste buds worked, how olfaction, which is aroma, worked, and how sound and all the other things, taste perception worked. But the moment it got into your food pipe, I was like, oh, the book stops right there. So that was always my position. And then the line got blurred only as I started doing Instagram and so on, because it was impossible for people to somehow separate diet and nutrition from food, right? And they were not able to enjoy food because they were forever thinking of whether something is a toxin, whether something is ultra processed, whether something is good for you, bad for you. And the social media, because of the short attention span, has ended up irrationally creating a bunch of villains and heroes. Some heroes like turmeric, a bunch of these things, and there's some villains, right? Maida, a bunch of these things. And the reality is that that's not how food works, right? And people have sugar is villain, but jaggery is not villain, right? They're both sugar, right? Honey is hero, but something else is brown sugar is bad for you. But they're both sugar. For your body, it has no difference, right? And so over time, it sort of became very harder to sort of separate the both. And I kind of came to recognize that to give credit to people, right? The design incentives of social media end up creating or incentivizing creators to create content focused on something sensational, one ingredient, this is poison, did you know this contains this, did you know they use caramel color, that is carcinogenic, and so on. So it's natural that people are sort of irrationally scared. And I kind of then realized that no, maybe I think the sensible way is to call that out and say, and by asking questions, right? If you say something is toxic, exactly how is it? What toxin is it producing? And you will find that most people are not able to answer that. The creators themselves. And then you'll ask them how much of that toxin in your body is actually toxic for you, right? Because it turns out that 5 liters of water in one shot is toxic for you.
Yeah,
right?
that's
Few grams, 3 grams of nutmeg is toxic for you.
Really?
Half a teaspoon of clove oil is toxic for you. Most spices are super toxic, by the way, right? In any amounts than the small, tiny amount we use, they will all mess up your liver. Turmeric is terrible for your liver, right? That's why we use a tiny amount. And then we overhype the benefits, right? So you need to consume 500 milligrams of turmeric to get like 1 milligram of curcumin or something, right? Which is the magical thing that prevents Alzheimer's and all that, right? So if you're trying to get curcumin by eating turmeric, you're not getting that.
Okay.
You then have to take supplements, and for which there is little or no evidence that it actually has any benefits, right? So the problem is people don't realize that you put half a teaspoon of turmeric for 5 people in the house. How much are you actually getting? And then if you eat turmeric milk like 3 times a day, it'll thin your blood. It'll also mess up your liver, right? So it is just that people have a distorted view of this, and my goal is not to give people advice, but to say, question the kind of scaremongering that people are doing by asking simple questions.
Yeah, it makes sense, because things like people are going, like you said, about jaggery and about palm sugar and coconut sugar, and at the end of it, it's about they all have the sugar. It's about the quantity that you actually consume.
Yeah.
So that's what makes the difference.
Absolutely. And again, to be fair, there are dishes where I would absolutely use palm sugar or jaggery because it is delicious.
It's the flavor that they add.
It's the flavor, right?
Yeah. So each thing comes with its own set of flavors.
But somehow fooling yourself that a dessert made from jaggery is healthier than a dessert made from white sugar. No, it's a dessert. Right?
It's an indulgence.
Right, it's an indulgence. And people say, no, jaggery has iron. To get your daily allowance, you need to eat 100 grams of jaggery.
Okay.
Right? That is a road to diabetes and metabolic problems and so on, right? So I think, that's the problem. People, and as I keep saying, that people have trouble with denominators. Sorry to use a math term, but everybody focuses on numerator. Nobody knows the denominator is huge. So when you actually divide, it's statistically trivial. That's what happens, right? Very, very tiny amount of benefits in honey, very tiny amount of benefits in jaggery, right? The meal matters much more than whether or not this was organic and then this was, artisanally, homemade and all of that, right? So that is secondary. I mean, if you're rich and posh enough to the point where you got your basics, then you can invest a lot of money in improving it by a tiny bit by going organic, by doing all of these other fancy things, right?
That's true. It's about, I think, a lot of perception and a lot about how you understand what you're getting.
Yeah.
So you love cooking.
Yes.
If I asked you for some tips, what are the meal planning tips that the Krish Ashok house uses? What would you tell us?
So part of my productivity hacks, one is obviously definitely use appliances like the electronic pressure cooker, which is, Instant Pot is the most popular brand, but any brand of electronic pressure cooker, which just takes the headache out of pressure cooking. No whistle, you don't have to wait, you don't have to risk whether it's going to explode. It'll quietly do, it'll reduce, it'll automatically take care of stuff. It'll not overcook, all of that is there, right? It takes the headache off that. Definitely for sure, embrace the microwave a lot more. It is very efficient. If you want to just heat some water for your tea or green tea or something, that is the most energy efficient way to heat, right? Okay. And therefore it is also fantastic for parallel processing. If you're using a stove, use the microwave, right? And then definitely embrace the fridge, right? So the way I would say is that the ways I prep, one is that if you're cooking dal, right? I end up pressure cooking 2 to 3 times more dal than I need. and then I refrigerate it. Right, it'll last for a week, and then every time you just take it out and then make the dal, rather than you having to wait half an hour to do that. Right. The second thing I do is that I also sometimes on the weekends I will make. Every weekend I might make like one base gravy. So what I'll do is that I'll take tomatoes, onions, cashews, some whole spices, garlic, and I'll boil them together and then make a paste and then freeze that. So next time I want to make like butter chicken or paneer makhani, take 2 cubes of that makhani gravy, add it straight to your dish, and then in 5 minutes your dish is done, right? You can make a chettinad gravy, a Bengali based gravy, and you have variety, right? I mean, so freezing base gravies is absolutely another sort of hack. And then the third one is actually flavored oils, right? So like for example, you can really add a flavor boost by having a bunch of different flavored oils, like chettinad flavored ghee or a Punjabi garam masala flavored ghee, right? So when you're actually making ghee from butter, you can add things like palm leaves, cinnamon, and others, and then fish it out. And now all those spice flavors are dissolved in the ghee. Now what you have is flavored ghee, right? So you can add powdered garam masala, or you can just add like a teaspoon of that ghee, and it'll be amazing, way better. So like how the Chinese and Japanese keep flavored oils all the time, right? The Sichuan chili oil and garlic oil and so on. Same thing, make it with Indian sort of ingredients, right? So these are ways in which you can very rapidly kind of obviously again freezing things like sourdough and so on. So that way, bread ends up going waste all the time, at least in Chennai. Right, and you do want to freeze, and I'm running out of space in the freezer now, right? So I don't end up storing the cheap bread, only the sourdough bread gets like special. So this is largely, so this saves a lot of time. So the amount of time for you to get from, hey, here's what I want to cook, is like literally half an hour, right? And again, this is something it's not something I would say I invented, but my mother would chop vegetables and put in the fridge because she had to go to office at 9. So she had to cook lunch at 7, right, for everyone, and before we went to office, right, when we were young. And so I knew that it was perfectly okay and acceptable to prep ahead, right? And just all you have to do is seal them, keep them airtight. You can chop vegetables and keep them airtight and so on. So that's what I would do. And
do you meal plan? Since you do meal prep, do you plan for the week ahead? Because I'm sure everybody has such busy lives.
Yeah, not. So we tend to sort of since we eat anything, so we tend to take a more dynamic approach to say, hey, what do you feel like eating today, right? Sure. So if you feel like eating Thai, something like that, then there's one of these curry paste that's already ready made there, and then chop some vegetables, and then you make a green curry, yellow curry or whatever it is, right? Add some shrimp, which will be there in the freezer. So because we have none of the people in the house have any dietary restrictions, right? So we end up being, so normally planning is required when you have a larger household and you have people, somebody has diabetes, somebody has heart disease, somebody has that, you do have to plan ahead, right? Because what you make for one person, other person may not like, it's too salty, it's too oily. And so for me, we can just in the evening come back and then say, hey, what do you feel like eating? Okay, Chinese, let's make Chinese, right? So that's the way it is. If you're prepped ahead, then it really saves time.
Yeah, that's actually at Keto Press we do a meal plan. So I send out a meal plan every week.
Yes.
Where the reason why we started it was every day the maid used to come, Didi, aaj khane mein kya bana hai?
Yes.
And you get sick of trying to figure out what.
Yes.
And so our meal plan covers everything that from lunch, breakfast, dinner, evening snack, bus snack, tiffin.
Yeah.
So you're covered for 6 meals.
Oh yeah.
So then it's easier for the mother who's running around.
Yes.
And then we send it on a Saturday so that you have time to prep, shop, and then you have time to figure out. You take everybody's opinions also into consideration.
Correct.
And then you have a basic framework to work with.
Yes.
And then obviously you'd have to keep people's choices in mind.
So the framework that I've evolved over time is to focus not on the individual dish that we're making, but the balance, meaning that every meal has to have a dominant protein and vegetables presence, and then a relatively smaller carbohydrates and other fried stuff, right? Okay. And so this is something, as we've grown older, I think, starting to eat healthy and so on. And this idea of eating the vegetables and protein first also causes a smaller blood sugar spike, which again helps you extend your the quality of your life, right? I mean, if you eat the protein and the vegetables first and then the rice, which is not what we do in India, because rice is first and then you pour everything on it and you eat it together, right? And that's something that so we've consciously attempted to change that. So therefore, idea is always that, protein, what do we do, right? Is there shrimp is there fish or shrimp? That's the easiest one because it's literally cooks in 30 seconds, right? If it's chicken, a little bit more work, a little bit more planning is required, but sometimes we will end up either sous vide or marinating it and keeping it. But then again, I wouldn't encourage people to keep in your regular fridge marinated meat for more than like a week, right? And even with all the acids, bacteria still thrive at the fridge temperatures unless you freeze it, right? And people don't like freezing the marinated meat, right? Although you can, right? But I would also then, in worst case, plan B is always egg, right? Make whatever you want, fry 2 eggs and your protein intake is done, right? And then we've consciously now also made sure that at least me and my wife are sort of regardless of what, and then maybe like the 25 grams of whey protein or something in the afternoon is just so in case you're out of that. I think a lot of Indians significantly underestimate protein intake, and I don't mean this just for the vegetarians. Even meat eaters in India actually simply do not eat enough protein in a day, right? So you might eat a fish curry, but that's like 3 fish swimming in a giant bowl, and you're probably getting like 1-2 grams, okay? And that's true for chicken curries and all that. It's not like the West where the people will eat like a giant chunk of steak and 4 pieces of fried chicken and all that. We don't do that, right? So we're almost always getting not enough protein, and people wrongly think things like dal are very high in protein.
Yeah, that's what.
Okay, but they're mostly carbs, and you still want to get other sources, right? You still, I keep telling my mother, you have to eat yogurt, right? She's vegetarian, so at least eat yogurt, right? Because that's some animal protein, right? You're not going to get all the essential amino acids from dal and rice. You do need something from animals, right? So that's why India does not have that many vegans. Many South Indians cannot digest milk like North Indians, right? So only 30% of South Indians South and East cannot digest milk as adults. North and West, the dairy belt, 70% of them can digest milk. So they can go to town on paneer and milk and all these other things. In a way, South Indians, they have to ferment it so that the bacteria eat the lactose, so you eat the yogurt. That's why curd rice is such a sort of like a very important thing for at least vegetarians in the South. Yeah.
Really, I didn't realize that the paneer fermentation was such a difference between.
Right, paneer is not fermented, right? It's just acid curdled.
Yeah.
So while it does not have as much lactose, it still has, right? Paneer still has fair amount of carbohydrates. And
but
that
people
lactose,
think of it as a huge protein source.
No, only 30%. 70% is fat. So 70% of the calories in paneer are fat, saturated fat. 30% is protein. Right? So people have to remember that. So you have to adjust. If you're eating paneer, then you better not have like tons of oil and butter in other dishes. So the paneer has like 70% fat.
Okay, I did not know that. Okay, on that subject, what is your take on cold pressed oils and refined oils?
So this is again, it's a very, so people often, there's a very natural tendency to try and say that we've been eating oils in a certain way for thousands of years and that should be the healthier way because we have evidence that it did not harm people. And so, whereas all this refined oils came the last 100 years and look at the amount of diabetes and heart disease and clearly that is to fault, right? Although that reasoning is wrong because the life expectancy in India at 1947 was like 40. Okay. So most people died young.
Yeah.
So they died before they got cancer and diabetes. That's the point, right? And the ones who survived were all genetic freaks. Like they were already pre-selected to be super healthy. So everyone is like, my grandfather was so healthy. Yes, because 3 of his siblings died in childhood. He is the lucky one, right? So people forget that, right? People had like 7 children, right? Only 3 would survive, right? So people only have 2 children. And I think the people forget that in the modern day, because of medicines and vaccines and all the lack of, malnutrition and all of that, people with very poor genetics and unhealthy lifestyles are living up to 80. And so visibly, you see them with diabetes, you see them with arthritis, you see them with all of these things. In pre-1940, they'd have been dead by their 40s. So this is something that people don't kind of recognize, right? So therefore, the way I see it is that, and again, so cold pressed and refined oils, fundamentally, they're both fat, okay, at the end of the day. Amount of fat in your diet is far more important than what fat you eat. And you can find research that tells you ghee is healthy. You can find research that says ghee is unhealthy. You can find research that says coconut oil is unhealthy. You can also find research that says it's unhealthy, right? People demonize palm oil here. Palm oil is the default fat in Malaysia, Indonesia, several parts of Africa, and people are quite healthy, right? So clearly the problem is fats are complicated. They have a ton of calories, 9 calories a gram. So you get a lot of calories in very short amount of time. There are genetic variations in how people process it. So there are some people, clearly a lot of people in Punjab can consume all the butter and ghee they want and they seem to be quite okay. But there are other people, if they consume a lot of ghee, arteries are going to get clogged. So there are genetic variations as well. So the problem with a lot of this is it's impossible to provide universal advice on what is good or bad, right? But cold press oils, one, they're more flavorful, but the moment you heat them, you've lost whatever benefits of whatever extra you paid for. So the flavor comes from things that are not fat, right? The other phytochemicals, polyphenols and all that, which are all heat sensitive. So in India, we heat oil to very high temperatures, tadka and all of that, right? Moment the temperature of oil is over 100, you've lost all of those molecules are destroyed. So you're paying extra for really nothing much, right? If you really want to enjoy the values of cold pressed oil, use them in salads or use them in very low temperatures, like, very light saute and so on. So the way I normally say it is, because the evidence is so complicated, eat as many different fats as you can. In fact, the good approach is, if you're eating a Bengali dish, cook it with mustard oil. If you're eating Kerala dish, cook it with coconut oil, and eat 4 or 5 different fats, because we don't know which one is good or bad. But you focus on keeping overall fat consumption low and keep saturated fats to about 10% of calories and so on is about the only consensus that people have. Everything else is tricky. We know monounsaturated fats are probably relatively slightly better in terms of evidence than polyunsaturated, and but it's all complicated. So the way I would say it is that use cold press oils for very light sauteing and use refined oils for deep frying. If you're making puris, the temperature has to be 180, 170 Celsius. In fact, you should not be using the cold press oils because they will burn and smoke and create carcinogenic substances. You do not want to use cold press oils for deep frying, right? Exception being mustard oil, which is remarkably high smoke point.
Yeah, the smoke point
even in the kachi, yes.
Yeah, I think you're right, because for me, when I use different kinds of things, it's depending on what I'm cooking. So if I'm cooking my Bengali food, then I will definitely use my mustard oil.
Yes.
A little bit of ghee when I'm doing North Indian, and like you said.
Yeah.
So it's about, for me, it's more about the flavor.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are very, very stringent about what they...
It's sort of, a lot of people, because of social media, people focus on the pickpocket and ignore the bank robber, right? Basically, amount of fat is the bank robber, and you don't pay attention to that. Cardiologists say that you should eat, an individual should eat 500 ml of fat a month.
Okay.
That's 1 tablespoon a day. Do you think we eat just 1 tablespoon of fat a day? Way more. We eat 3 times more. So first focus on, if you bring that down, then it doesn't matter what you're eating. It could be palm oil for all we care, or extra virgin olive oil, it doesn't really matter. But if you are eating like large amounts of fat, then if you're only eating 1 fat, then you increase the risk that if it so turns out, research finds out that, oh no, there is actually a problem with mustard oil because it has erucic acid. By the way, mustard oil is banned in the US and European Union.
Really?
Yes. So Bengalis who live in the US and Europe, they have to buy mustard oil from Indian stores that has to carry the label not for cooking. And they buy it, it's supposed to be only for hair, but they buy it and use it for cooking. Because mustard oil naturally has high levels of an acid called erucic acid, which for some reason, based on research in the 1960s, Europeans and Americans have said, no, it is unhealthy for the heart. Okay. Despite Bengalis and North Indians and Bangladeshis, using it for centuries, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of, conspiracy theories about the fact that the Canadians genetically modified mustard to make canola oil, right? Which is low erucic acid, and they say that perhaps it's that lobby preventing mustard oil being imported into the US, so that canola oil is what they use. Canola oil is basically low erucic acid mustard-like oil, right? So it's similar, right? But so therefore, the thing is that these are all complicated, right? People will say cottonseed oil is very bad, but the entire cotton belt of India cooks in cottonseed oil only.
Yeah, I think it's also a lot about eating what is local.
Yeah.
And you kind of adjust your...
Yeah, you do get adjusted, yes.
So I have a couple of questions for you. One is on salts. There are so many different kinds of salts.
Yeah.
Pink salt, black salt, Himalayan salt. Which one do you think works or doesn't work?
Yeah. I mean, let me go back to the mathematical point I made about denominators. Right? The first question to ask is, what percentage of pink salt is sodium chloride? And it turns out to be 98%.
Oh.
Right? So 2% of pink salt is all of these other fancy things, right? The next question is how much salt you use when you make a dish? A tablespoon, teaspoon, a couple of teaspoons, right? For an entire dish. So think about 2% of that is the amount of minerals you're getting. That is not even a rounding error. So therefore, you're just paying through the roof for zero benefits. It's just salt, right? The only variations can be in flavor, right? Because the salts can be rough and textured, right? So kosher salt has a more coarser texture. Your desi kind of salt has a thick sort of this thing, and then you have your black salt has a sulfurous smell, which we use like in chaat masala, smells of eggs and so on, right? And pinks, but the point is that I think again you are simply not getting, you're getting such a tiny amount of those things that it's completely irrelevant and trivial. Okay. So in that sense that, and here's another danger, right? India has a large number of vegetarians relative to other parts of the world, right? And in the 1930s and 40s, we recognized that these vegetarians had a serious problem. They were not getting enough iodine, and so poorer children were having these goiter and these thyroid issues, which actually affects brain development when you're. So it's a serious issue, and that's the reason why worldwide people started to iodize salt, right, and add that sodium iodide. So that way, salt is being used every day, and you don't need much, and it's there. These other fancy salts, unless you pay attention, they're not iodized.
Yes.
Right? And these vegetarian people using these fancy salts, they're taking these serious, irresponsible risks. So I would actually tell them, by all means, you're making some fancy dish, use that. But on your day-to-day basis, please use iodized salt, or buy one of those pink salts that is iodized.
Yeah, we don't realize, and I didn't realize this for a while, that pink salt actually does not contain iodine.
No, not naturally, unless you add it, right? Yeah. Because again, so pink salt comes from all pink salt in the world comes from one mine in Pakistan. All pink salt. That's why they call it Himalayan pink salt, because they don't want to call it Pakistani pink salt for branding reasons. But it all comes from there, right? And it's very far away from the sea. Iodine is something that you find closer to the sea in fish and eggs and so on. So iodine, natural sources of iodine, not plants, all animals. So if you're vegetarian, you have a problem. Okay. So that is why we decided to iodize salt, right? Yeah.
Okay, just gonna have a quick rapid fire.
Yes.
And we're gonna end this. Okay, chefs you follow religiously.
Oh, it varies. I have a bunch of bookmarked people for various cuisines, right? So I obviously love Ranveer Brar's. It's just the storytelling and the beautiful videos he makes. And for North Indian vegetarian, Nisha Madhulika is like absolute. Then Chennai Samail, Madras Samail for South Indian sort of meat and so on. I have one such person for Andhra cooking and so on. And likewise, Hebar's Kitchen for very rapid, quick South Indian Karnataka style dishes. And then the Salu's Kitchen for Malabar, sort of Kerala cooking, and Bong Eats for, Bengali cooking and so on, right? So I follow these, and there are a couple of these other. My only rule is the person cooking should be speaking the language of the place where the food is from, right?
I agree.
So it's like Telugu cooking, the person has to be speaking in Telugu. So that's my way of, so Spanish, Mexican, it should be some old abuela sort of cooking in a kitchen, and I know that, yes, that's what I want to do.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
One spice you love cooking with?
Oh, it keeps changing, but I really, really like black cardamom, right? I mean, it has a more muskier, meatier, savory flavor compared to green cardamom, right? Sort of like, green cardamom is like Sachin and black cardamom is like Rahul Dravid, right? Somebody dependable, reliable, the wall, right? And it's fantastic in meat dishes. So yeah, so I like black cardamom.
Okay, one ingredient that is overhyped and unhealthy.
Oh, this is a big list. I mean, I can literally name everything from jaggery to honey to turmeric to you name it. Anything, green tea, to literally everything is, the benefits are overhyped. Like for example, here weirdly enough, the only beverage for which there is 40 years of research backing significant health benefits, a 15-20% reduction in the chances of heart disease and so on for people who consume at least 3 to 4 cups a day. The only beverage is black coffee, and yet people think coffee is bad for you, right? No proof that tea is good. In fact, too much green tea, bad for the liver, right? Coffee is not. Tea is actually very bad for the liver. Lot of tea, right? I mean, not your regular black tea, green tea, right? And so therefore, I think there are too many things. I think it's very simple. Anytime somebody says something is a superfood, there's a good chance that it's probably overhyped. It's probably okay as part of a balanced meal, but don't break your head. Yeah.
Okay. 3 cookbooks that you would recommend?
Oh, it keeps changing, but I've always enjoyed Harold McGee's On Food and Cooking. I think sort of like the Bible of food science. But yeah, it's like 2,000 pages and not for everyone. Samin Nosrat's Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, absolutely. And there is also a book, there is also Food Lab by Kenji Lopez Alt, which is sort of one of the books that inspired me to write Masala Lab. In fact, the name also, right? Food Lab and Masala Lab is sort of inspired from Food Lab. That's sort of like the science book for Western cooking, day-to-day cooking with a lot of pictures, and this is for Indian cooking. Yeah.
Interesting. And oil or ghee, which is a healthier option?
Neither of them. So I think if you're consuming a lot of fat, both will do damage.
Yeah.
If you're consuming a small amount, pick either one. It doesn't matter. Enjoy life. Use ghee. If you're using small amounts, it tastes better, right? For the right dish, right?
Eggs, tofu, or paneer, which is a healthier source of protein?
Hard to say. I think they're all okay. Again, paneer is 70% fat, so I do want to call that out. So I would not put paneer in the same grade. Tofu again is a lot of water, right? So you'd have to eat a lot of tofu.
Okay.
Eggs actually are really, really good. People have demonized the yolk because it has cholesterol and all that. Now there is evidence that the dietary sources of cholesterol don't actually affect your.
Okay.
There is like more complicated evidence. So therefore, I would actually say eggs probably the best. And if you're vegetarian, I think tofu is fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Hacks that would work if you want to cook fluffy rice.
Fluffy rice. So I think first and foremost, you need a variety of rice that is high on amylose, right? So this is your Sona Masuri, Basmati, Samba, and so on, right? Unlike say Govindabhog or the Ponni, which are sort of low amylose, so they will stick. So first you need something that is high amylose. The second thing is you need to wash it till the water runs clear, right? So that's another important step, right? Because that causes sticking. And then the next thing is that cook it on an open pot if you want fluffy. Convenience, I think an instant pot, pressure cooker is perfectly fine, daily stuff, right? But if you want the perfect sort of rice that you want to use in a biryani or a pulao and so on, you want to cook it in the open pot where you want to bring it to a boil, add salt, then add the rice, and then once the water reaches the level of the rice, then reduce it to the lowest heat and close it. And then here's the important thing, after 10-15 minutes the water will empty. Then after that, don't open it for another 15 minutes. So actually cooking fluffy rice takes like 45 minutes. So it's not for everyone, but if you want perfectly fluffy rice, this is the time that it takes, right?
There's a science behind that.
Yeah, and then most important, last step, you do have to open it and use a fork to fluff it up.
I agree. That's what I do.
Because that's what allows the gases to escape, and then otherwise it will become mushy and sticky at the bottom.
Yeah, the fork I use, and I think it makes a difference when I use my rice
cooker. Big
cooker.
difference, yeah, yes.
Yeah. Chop onions without frying, a hack that you have tried and works.
So what actually happens when you cut an onion is that the onion does not want to die, right? So it has some defenses, right? So every time you cut a cell, there's an enzyme that kicks off a reaction that takes 30 seconds, by the way. So for that reaction to complete, and it produces a volatile sulfurous molecule, which when it hits your eye, breaks down into dilute sulfuric acid. So basically the onion's way of defending itself is acid attack, right? So that's why you tear up. Now, that enzyme that causes that reaction works only at like typical room temperature, right? So anywhere 20 to 30 and all of that. So if your onion is really cold, right? So, but the problem is you can't store the onions in the fridge. So what you do is that you briefly put the onion in the freezer for like about 10-15 minutes before you're cutting it. And you will find that you will not cry because the onion will still be cold and that enzyme reaction won't happen. And if you're good with you're very fast, then you can avoid crying entirely. What professional chefs do is that they have very sharp knives and they're so good with cutting an onion that they finish the entire cutting in under 30 seconds. So if you can cut under 30 seconds, you won't cry because it takes 30 seconds for that reaction to happen. Okay. So they immediately cut, close it, and then put it in, close it so that you don't. A couple of other things, like for example, I think if you have to cut the root at the last.
Okay.
The moment you cut the root, that's what's going to,
That triggers off the.
Yeah, I mean that's where the baby onion plant is, right? So that's where it wants to protect. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And
so I think I always keep telling that sometimes people assume that the concept of death and slaughter applies only to animals. No, you're killing plants in the kitchen, right? The plant is alive till the point when you cook it or you cut it. So unlike a piece of chicken or fish, which is dead well ahead of time, right? So it is, yeah.
The onion I'm going to try.
Yes.
Because I've had copious amounts of crying and I really want to sort that out. Okay, if you bite into a green chili, what is a quick hack that can...
So generally water and these things don't work. You need something to wash off the casein. Protein in milk apparently washes off, and fat and protein tends to wash that off. It's fat soluble, right? Capsaicin, which burns, causes the burning sensation. So milk is usually one that is recommended, but again, on a practical note, at least in my home, I'm not going to rapidly find milk ready. I have to cut open a packet and all that. It's not going to work, right? Milk is not always available. So yogurt is always available, so it works too. But if it's really, really bad, what works better than yogurt, instantaneous relief, is ice cream.
Yeah, vanilla ice cream is actually what I have.
Cream, it's the cream part. So it's any kind of cream, because it's fat and casein, low temperature, all three things will switch off that receptor. So remember that the chili is actually tricking the temperature receptor.
Okay.
So it's fooling the temperature receptor into thinking that something physically hot is in your mouth.
Okay.
That's the chili's way of defending itself from not being eaten. And again, the reason it did that is because birds do not have that sensor. So chilies expect birds to eat the chilies and sort of drop the seeds elsewhere. The birds cannot feel the chili seed, so they're designed to eat chilies, right? So we, on the other hand, we enjoy that phantom pain, and so we kind of, we've gotten used to it, right? So ice cream actually is low temperature, so that will also turn off that receptor.
Yeah, it does numb out your teeth, tongue. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, the last one. If you have to set curd and you don't have a starter, have you tried any hack that works?
It depends. If you have like decent organic ginger peel, that will also help.
Okay.
There are many sources of lactobacteria. Ginger peel is actually probably one of the most common. The second one is the stalk of chili.
So I've used the stalk of the chili.
Yeah.
This is the first time I'm hearing about the ginger.
Also, yeah.
I've never.
So in fact, ginger is quite interesting because the ginger peel has both yeast and bacteria.
Okay.
So you can actually take water, put chopped ginger with the peel and equal amounts of sugar, and then like a sourdough starter, keep feeding it every day sugar and ginger peel, right? And in 3 days, you'll actually have something called a ginger bug, which is a starter of bacteria and yeast. And now you take a little bit of that liquid and add any fruit juice, it will ferment it. Okay. That is how ginger beer used to be made, right? So, and if you're right, so basically, don't try this if you're in a dry state like Gujarat or Bihar or Nagaland, but up to 1% alcoholic, very, very healthy probiotic, like a kombucha basically.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called ginger beer. So that's how originally ginger beer used to be made. It's very super healthy, very tasty. You can take like coconut water, add sugar, then add a little bit of this. You'll get something that's 1% alcoholic and tastes like kaldu that you get in like Kerala. Right? It's fantastic. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so you can use the ginger peel to ferment yogurt as well. But again, it has to be fresh ginger. So that's the thing. Right?
I've tried a green chili.
Yeah, and green chili also works.
Yeah, yes. Green chili, keep the stem.
Yeah.
Keep it dipped in, and I've tried that.
So it's the only part of the chili plant that doesn't have that burning molecule. So that's the only part of the chili plant that bacteria can attack or fungi can attack.
Okay.
So that is why all the bacteria live there. They're just waiting for the fruit to become sort of mushy and for the cells to lose their defenses so that they then end up spoiling the chili, right? And so that's why you remove the stalk and save your chilies in the fridge. They'll last months.
Okay.
So that's why you should never, if you want chilies to last longest, remove the stalk and store them in the fridge. They'll last forever.
It's been an amazing chat, Krish. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you have enjoyed it too.
Absolutely.